bank worker's flashlight caught the edge of a record book on March 14, 1978. He had opened hundreds of empty properties that banks took back, but none had been left alone this long. 11 years of dust covered everything in the Mountain Lodge office. But the guest book was open on the desk as if someone had just walked away while writing in it. Before we jump into the story, quick question. What's the scariest case you've ever heard about or experienced yourself? Write it in the comments. Let's share stories. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe. We're building a group of people who look for the truth and aren't scared of dark stories. Now, let's continue with the story. Raymond Fulcher had been handling empty property for First Mountain Trust for 12 years. The Ridgway Lodge papers had been stuck in court since 1967, tied up in legal problems with an owner who disappeared without paying his bills. The property sat 18 miles outside Asheville, North Carolina, and you could only reach it by a dirt road that got washed away every spring. No one had taken care of it. No one had visited. The bank finally ran out of patience. The March afternoon felt damp and cold the way it does in the Appalachian Mountains. Fulcher's boots left marks in the dust at the main entrance. The lobby still had signs of simple beauty: a stone fireplace on one wall, wooden chairs arranged in groups that would never hold conversations again. Photos hung crooked on the walls, showing the building when it was open for business, though even those pictures looked cold and unwelcoming. The office door stood partly open. Fulcher pushed it wider with his clipboard, keeping the professional distance he'd learned to keep from properties that had been empty too long. The desk held normal office items: a rotary phone, a pad stained with ink, a brass lamp with a torn shade. But the record book caught his attention right away. He walked up to it carefully, as if the book might somehow not want to be looked at. The pages showed careful record-keeping, dates going back to 1923 when the lodge first opened. Names filled the columns, arrival dates and leaving dates written in neat handwriting. For the first 30 years, the entries were different. Different names, different lengths of stay, the natural pattern of a working business. Then something changed. Fulcher flipped forward, watching the entries change. 1954 marked a big shift. After that year, only 6 names appeared. The same 6 names repeated week after week, month after month for 13 years. No other guests, no changes, just these 6 people checking in and out over and over like clockwork. Arnold Vickery, Clarence Drummond, Harold Finch, Eugene Lattimore, Bernard Stark, Walter Pewitt. The names went through the pages in a pattern, and the handwriting got messier and harder to read as the years went by. Early entries showed steady, controlled writing. By the 1960s, the letters leaned and shook, some barely readable. The last entry, dated October 19, 1967, looked like it was written by someone whose hand was shaking really badly. Fulcher took pictures of several pages with a Polaroid camera he carried to record things. The entries didn't make business sense. Why would 6 people return to a faraway mountain lodge week after week for over 10 years? Why were there no other guests during this whole time? The pattern suggested something beyond normal hotel business. He moved to the file cabinets against the office walls. Most drawers were stuck from not being used, metal scraping against metal. When he finally forced one open, he found worker records going back to when the lodge started. Medical staff, people who took care of the grounds, kitchen workers. The business had once employed 15 people. All jobs ended in the same month, October 1967. The afternoon light disappeared quickly at this height. Fulcher gathered his first papers and walked back into the lobby. Tomorrow he would bring a full team to check everything, but as he locked the front entrance, he found himself looking back at the dark windows on the upper floors. The building had 3 floors. He'd only looked at the ground level. Whatever answers those 6 repeated names meant, they waited somewhere in the rooms above, in the spaces where dust had settled over questions that no one had thought to ask for 11 years. The Asheville newspaper ran a small announcement on May 7, 1923. New healing center opens in mountain location. The article described the Ridgway Lodge as a special treatment center for people hurt in factory accidents, talking about the healing benefits of mountain air and being far from cities. The founder, Dr. Gerald Dunor, had bought the property through a company registered in Tennessee, even though the building was in North Carolina. Local officials were happy about the development. The county needed business activity. 3 cloth mills had closed in the Prairie. It was 5 years, and lumber companies were cutting back. A medical building meant jobs, supply contracts, and property tax money. No one checked Dr. Dunnor's credentials or asked why a licensed doctor would choose such a faraway location for his practice. The truth was in records 300 miles away. The Pennsylvania State Medical Board had taken away Dunnor's license in 1921 after looking into his treatment methods at a private hospital outside Philadelphia. The board sealed its findings, saying they were protecting patient privacy. Dunnor left the state within weeks of losing his license, and nobody knew where he went until the Ridgeway Lodge opened 2 years later. The building itself sat on 40 acres of mountainside, and you could only reach it by the dirt road that climbed through thick forest. Winter snow made the route impossible to use for weeks at a time. Spring rains turned it into a mud channel that broke vehicle axles. Even in summer, the trip from Asheville took 2 hours of careful driving. This faraway location was the main part of Dunnor's business plan. He advertised in factory safety bulletins and workers' payment newsletters across Virginia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. The facility, he claimed, offered special healing services you couldn't get in regular hospitals. His letters to insurance companies talked about saving money, flat monthly rates that included all treatment, no surprise charges, no family visits interrupting healing processes. The first patients arrived in July of 1923. Work records show Dunnor hired a small staff, 2 nurses, both recently finished with a mail-order course, a groundskeeper named Luther Vance who'd worked in logging camps, and a cook. No other medical professionals joined the operation. For a place claiming to treat serious factory injuries, the staff seemed very small. Admission papers kept in the county records show the types of cases Dunnor accepted: crushed arms and legs from mill machinery, severe burns from factory accidents, back injuries from construction site falls. These were men whose injuries stopped them from returning to their old work, men whose families struggled to take care of them, men whose insurance companies faced years of ongoing medical costs. Dunnor offered a solution. His healing program, he promised, would either restore their ability to function or provide comfortable long-term care in a peaceful setting. Insurance companies found this plan appealing. Families overwhelmed by taking care of badly injured men often agreed to the transfer. The monthly letters Dunnor sent to relatives described steady progress, special treatments, gradual improvement. But discharge records from those early years raise questions. Between 1923 and 1941, the lodge admitted 62 patients. Only 18 were documented as returning home. The others simply disappeared from the official record. No death certificates filed with the county, no transfers to other facilities, no explanations beyond vague references to continued treatment or extended recovery. The Asheville newspaper never wrote a follow-up to its first announcement. The county tax worker noted the property's value and collected money accordingly. The sheriff's department had no reason to visit a faraway medical facility. Dunnor kept his isolation carefully, ordering supplies through mail catalogs, communicating with families through standard letters, creating a world that operated beyond normal watching. By the time the United States entered World War II, the Ridgeway Lodge had been operating for nearly 20 years. Its reputation in workers' payment circles was solid. Insurance companies trusted it. Families believed the reassuring monthly updates. And high in the North Carolina mountains, behind walls that no inspector ever checked, Gerald Dunnor continued his work with patients who had nowhere else to go and no one asking the right questions about where they'd gone. The pattern showed up when a graduate student at the University of North Carolina put together factory accident information for her 1979 research paper. She'd been looking at workers' payment cases across 3 states, tracking what happened to badly injured workers. Ridgeway Lodge appeared in her information with disturbing frequency. Between 1946 and 1967, 38 workers from cloth operations, lumber mills, and construction sites had been transferred there following terrible injuries. She found the admission records easily enough. The discharge records proved impossible to find. Insurance company files told one story: monthly bills from Dr. Dunnor paid without question for years, treatment summaries describing ongoing healing. Then in each case a final note: patient discharged, case closed. But the dates didn't make sense. A man admitted with a cut-off arm in 1949 showed treatment charges through 1962, then a closure. Another patient paralyzed in a mill accident in 1953 had bills until 1966. She contacted families. Most had the same experience. First letters describing their loved one's condition. monthly updates promising steady progress, then a final letter stating the patient had been discharged to continue recovery on their own. No forwarding addresses, no phone numbers. Several families had tried visiting the lodge only to be turned away at the property entrance by groundskeepers who claimed medical rules prevented visitation. The letters kept by these families showed Dunor's method. His letters followed templates, changing only names and small details. Your husband continues to respond well to treatment. The mountain air and special treatments have produced measurable improvement in his condition. We expect several more months of healing before discharge becomes appropriate. Month after month, year after year, the same reassurances with slight changes. One letter saved by a widow in Knoxville stood out for being unusually specific. Her husband had suffered severe burns in a 1951 metal factory accident. Dunor's letters described detailed treatment plans, special skin treatments, new tissue rebuilding procedures, experimental healing techniques not available in regular settings. The technical language impressed insurance workers. The widow received her letters and believed her husband was receiving extraordinary care. When the letters stopped in 1964, she made the journey to Ridgeway Lodge. The groundskeeper who met her at the gate told her that her husband had been discharged 3 weeks earlier, that he'd asked for no family contact during his adjustment period, that she should expect to hear from him soon. She never did. Her questions to Dr. Dunor went unanswered. Local police told her that if a grown man chose not to contact his family, no crime had happened. The graduate student found similar stories across her research. Families promised progress, then suddenly told about discharge, then silence. She tried to trace the discharged patients. Social Security records showed no work after their lodge stays. Death certificates existed for only 4 of the 38 people, filed by county officials in distant locations, with causes listed as natural or accidental. What happened to the others? Insurance companies had closed their files, satisfied that treatment had ended. Families had been told their relatives had chosen independence, but 34 men who'd entered Ridgeway Lodge for healing had simply vanished from all official records. The graduate student brought her findings to her research advisor, who suggested she narrow her research focus. The information raised uncomfortable questions about watching failures spanning decades. Publishing such findings would implicate insurance companies, medical licensing boards, and county officials. She completed her research paper using different information. The Ridgeway material went into a box in her apartment, disturbing and unresolved. But she documented something important, a clear pattern of men entering the lodge and never provably leaving. The monthly billing had been real. The patients had been real. Their disappearance from all traceable records was equally real. Somewhere in those mountains, Dr. Gerald Dunor had been doing something that required being far away, secrecy, and the kind of patients whose absence would cause minimal investigation. Luther Vance worked at Ridgeway Lodge for 4 years before he walked off the property in June of 1952. He never went back. When a reporter from the Asheville newspaper tracked him down in 1979, living in a trailer home outside Knoxville, he'd spent 27 years trying to forget what he'd heard through those walls. The interview appeared in a small local paper buried in the back pages. Vance spoke carefully, aware that he'd signed papers when he was hired forbidding him from discussing the facility's operations. But enough time had passed, and the lodge had been closed long enough that he felt the risk worth taking. He'd been hired in 1948 as a groundskeeper and general fix-it worker. The pay was better than anything available in the logging camps where he'd spent most of his working life. Dr. Dunor required only basic upkeep, maintain the access road, handle repairs, manage deliveries. The job seemed straightforward until Vance understood the restrictions. The lodge had 2 sections. The ground floor housed office spaces, a kitchen, and staff rooms. The upper 2 floors were the medical wing, accessible only through a locked door at the bottom of the main staircase. Dunor kept the only key. The nurses had limited access, let in only when called. Vance was specifically forbidden from entering under any circumstances. "I never saw the patients," he told the reporter. "Not once in 4 years. I'd hear them sometimes, especially at night, sounds that didn't match what you'd expect from men recovering from accidents. Dr. Dunor said they were medical procedures, things a groundskeeper wouldn't understand. He said the isolation prevented infection, that these men needed absolute cleanliness in their recovery environment." The story might have been believable if not for the deliveries. Once a month, A truck arrived from Tennessee carrying medicine supplies. Vance helped unload the boxes. The amount struck him as too much for a small facility. More troubling were the unmarked bottles, medicines that came without proper labels or paperwork. The driver worked for a supply company that Vance later learned had no proper licensing. Then there were the sounds. Vance's room was in a separate building behind the main lodge, close enough that noise carried on quiet nights. He described hearing things that disturbed his sleep, long crying that didn't sound like pain from physical injuries, voices begging in ways that suggested confusion rather than suffering, periods of complete silence that lasted for days. In the spring of 1951, one of the nurses quit suddenly. She left without collecting her final paycheck, leaving while Dr. Dunor was away on a supply trip. Vance found her packing frantically and urged her to tell him what had happened. She refused, saying only that what Dunor called treatment wasn't treatment at all, that she couldn't continue participating, that she'd signed papers preventing her from reporting what she'd witnessed. Vance tried reporting his concerns to the Madison County Sheriff in February of 1952. He drove to the county seat, requested a private meeting, explained his suspicions about the lodge's operations. The deputy who took his statement seemed uninterested. Medical facilities operated under different rules, he said. Without evidence of a specific crime, without a complaint from a patient or family member, the sheriff's department had no grounds for investigation. Besides, the deputy added, what did a groundskeeper know about medical procedures? 4 months later, Vance collected his tools and walked down the mountain road. He never asked for his final paycheck. He never explained his leaving to anyone at the lodge. He simply recognized that some situations were beyond his ability to change or understand, and that continuing to work there made him part of something he couldn't fully name but knew was wrong. I should have pushed harder, he told the reporter in 1979. Should have made someone listen, but I was scared. Dunor had this way of looking at you like he was deciding whether you were useful or problematic. I chose to be neither. I chose to disappear before he decided for me. By the time the interview was published, investigators were already beginning to dig up the property. What they found would prove Vance's instincts correct. The financial expert spent 3 weeks rebuilding Dr. Gerald Dunor's money records. What she found in August of 1979 went against everything the insurance companies had assumed about their closed cases. Elizabeth Grantham had been hired by a group of insurers who'd begun questioning their Ridgeway Lodge payments after the graduate students' research came out. The numbers initially seemed routine: monthly treatment fees, medicine costs, facility maintenance, standard billing for long-term healing care. But Grantham specialized in finding patterns that showed fraud, and Ridgeway's records contained patterns that suggested something far worse than simple overcharging. He started with a patient named Harold Finch, transferred to the lodge in 1947 following a cloth mill accident that crushed both his legs. His insurance company had paid monthly treatment fees for 19 years, finally closing the case in 1966 with a note of successful discharge. The total paid $63,000, a large sum for that time. Grantham got Finch's death certificate filed with the official in Raleigh in 1964. Cause of death: heart failure. The certificate had been signed by a local funeral director, not a doctor. She contacted the funeral home, which had no record of handling Finch's remains. The death certificate looked legitimate on the surface, complete with an official seal, but the details didn't hold up under close looking. And she noticed something that made her call the state insurance commissioner. For 2 years after Finch's documented death, his insurance company had continued paying Ridgeway Lodge for his treatment. The billing stopped in 1966, but not because of his death. It stopped because Dr. Dunor submitted discharge paperwork showing Finch had recovered enough to leave the facility. A dead man apparently treated for 2 years after his death, then discharged as recovered. She found 11 similar cases, patients with death certificates filed in various counties across North Carolina and Tennessee. Yet their insurance companies continued receiving bills from Ridgeway Lodge for months or years afterward. The death certificates all shared oddities, signed by funeral directors or rural doctors rather than the treating doctor, filed in counties far from the lodge, causes of death vague enough to avoid detailed questions. The organized gnat. Yours suggested deliberate construction. Dunor had been filing false death certificates while continuing to bill for treatment, then eventually submitting discharge paperwork to close the insurance cases. The scheme made substantial money. continued payments for patients who were supposedly dead, plus the original fees for patients who were simply never accounted for. But Grantham's analysis revealed something more disturbing than money fraud. She calculated the total number of patients admitted to Ridgeway Lodge across its 44 years of operation, 87 people. She then put together every documented discharge, death certificate, and family contact. The counting showed only 23 patients with clear evidence of leaving the facility. 64 people had simply vanished into the paperwork gap between admission and discharge. No death records, no discharge papers, no trace in later Social Security work records. The insurance companies had closed their files, satisfied by Dunnor's final paperwork. The families had received letters explaining that their loved ones had been discharged and wanted independence. But none of these people appeared in any checkable records after entering the lodge. The fraud wasn't just about money. It was an organized erasing of human beings from official existence. Insurance companies had been paying to keep people in a facility where they disappeared from all documented reality. Their continued existence reduced to monthly bills and fake letters. Grantham's report landed on the desks of state investigators in September of 1979. Her conclusion was professional but devastating. Ridgeway Lodge had operated for 4 decades as something other than a healing facility. The money records suggested that patients admitted for legitimate treatment had been kept forever, their presence hidden through detailed paperwork manipulation, their fates unknown. The question that haunted her final report was simple but terrible. If these people hadn't been discharged and hadn't died according to legitimate records, where were they? What had Dr. Gerald Dunnor been doing with 64 human beings whose existence he'd carefully erased from every official document except his own fake billing statements? The letters arrived in cardboard boxes delivered to the state investigator's office throughout October of 1979. Families who'd read newspaper coverage of the Ridgeway investigation sent decades of letters, hoping someone might finally explain what had happened to their fathers, husbands, brothers. Margaret Lattimore's collection was among the most complete. Her husband, Eugene, had been transferred to the lodge in 1951 after a construction accident left him with severe back damage. For 13 years, she received monthly letters from Dr. Dunnor describing Eugene's gradual improvement, his positive response to special treatments, his growing strength and ability to move. The letters followed a careful rhythm. Early letters acknowledged the seriousness of Eugene's injuries while offering measured hope. Your husband's condition remains serious, but we have observed small improvements in his responsiveness to treatment. The special equipment available at our facility provides healing options not available elsewhere. 3 months later, Eugene continues to show progress. His pain management has improved significantly, and we have begun more advanced healing processes. Year after year, the updates continued. Eugene was responding well. Eugene was participating in therapy. Eugene sent his love but found letter writing difficult due to his injuries. Margaret should remain patient. Recovery from such severe trauma required time and special care that only Ridgeway Lodge could provide. She visited once in the summer of 1953. The journey from Charlotte took most of a day. When she finally reached the property gate, a man she assumed was the groundskeeper stopped her vehicle. Dr. Dunnor's policy prevented family visits during critical treatment phases, he explained. Eugene's condition had recently become unstable, requiring complete isolation to prevent infection. Any interruption might ruin months of progress. He handed her a sealed envelope containing a letter from Dunnor repeating these restrictions, along with assurance that Eugene understood and supported this decision for his own welfare. Margaret returned home and continued receiving her monthly updates. In 1964, the letters stopped. She waited 3 weeks before calling the telephone number listed on Dunnor's letterhead. A woman's voice, professional and distant, told her that Eugene had been discharged the previous month. He'd made enough recovery to continue his healing independently. The lodge had no forwarding information, as patients often preferred privacy during their return to normal life. She filed a missing person report with the Charlotte police. They contacted Madison County authorities, who confirmed that Eugene Lattimore had been a patient at Ridgeway Lodge and had been legitimately discharged. Without evidence of wrongdoing, without any sign that Eugene hadn't left voluntarily, they couldn't investigate further. Adult men had the right to cut family ties if they chose. Similar stories filled the boxes delivered to investigators. A daughter writing about her father, Bernard Stark, admitted in 1955 with burns covering 40% of his body, 12 years of letters describing his recovery, then sudden silence in 1967. A sister asking about her brother Walter Pewitt, who'd lost an arm in a lumber mill accident in 1949, 15 years of monthly letters assuring her of his improving condition, then a final letter stating he'd been discharged and requested no family contact. The investigators noticed something in the dates. The 6 names that appeared repeatedly in the lodge's guest book after 1954 matched 6 of the family's missing relatives. Arnold Vickery, Clarence Drummond, Harold Finch, Eugene Lattimore, Bernard Stark, Walter Pewitt. These were men whose families had lost contact years earlier, whose insurance companies had closed their files, whose existence had been reduced to monthly letters and billing statements. Yet, according to the guest book, they'd been at the lodge every week from 1954 through 1967. Not as patients, the record book listed them in guest columns, as if they'd been visiting rather than receiving treatment. The handwriting that recorded their names had grown increasingly messy, the entries becoming harder to read as the years went by until the final note in October of 1967, where the writing looked almost impossible to read. What had these 6 men become during their years at Ridgeway Lodge? Why had their status changed from patients to something else? And why had their families been told they'd been discharged years before the guest book showed them still present at the facility? The dental records arrived from 6 different counties across 3 states. By November of 1979, investigators had confirmed what the families suspected but couldn't prove. The 6 names going through the guest book belonged to men who'd been declared discharged or dead years before those entries were written. Arnold Vickery's dental records came from a clinic in Roanoke, Virginia. He'd been transferred to Ridgeway Lodge in 1948 following a factory accident that cut off 3 fingers and damaged his left arm. His insurance company had paid treatment fees until 1953, when Dunor submitted discharge paperwork stating Vickery had recovered enough to return home. His family received a letter explaining that Arnold had decided to start fresh in another state, requesting no contact during his adjustment period. The guest book showed his name appearing weekly from 1954 through 1967, 14 years after his supposed discharge. Clarence Drummond's records told a similar story. Admitted in 1947 with severe leg injuries from a mining accident, officially discharged in 1952. Yet his name continued appearing in the guest record for 15 more years. His wife had received notification of his death in 1956, a certificate filed in a Tennessee county claiming heart failure as the cause. She'd never seen his body, told that he'd requested cremation and a private ceremony. Harold Finch, whose fake billing had caught the financial experts' attention, appeared in the guest book through 1967, despite his 1964 death certificate. The other 3 men showed identical patterns, official records claiming discharge or death, families assured of their loved one's departure, yet the record book documented their continued presence at the facility. But presence as what? The guest book format suggested they weren't patients anymore. Patients would have been recorded in medical logs, in treatment schedules, in medicine distribution records. The guest columns suggested something different, a status that Dunor had chosen not to formally document anywhere else. State investigators got permission to dig up remains from Harold Finch's supposed burial site in Raleigh. The funeral home had listed an address for his grave in Oakwood Cemetery. When they opened the plot in early December, they found it empty. No casket, no remains, just undisturbed dirt that clearly had never held a burial. Similar dig-ups across the region showed the same result. Of the 12 death certificates Dunor had filed over the years, only 3 matched actual burials. The other 9 were pure lies, official documents describing deaths and burials that had never happened. The pattern suggested a horrifying possibility. These men hadn't been discharged. They hadn't died and been buried. They'd remained at Ridgeway Lodge long after their families believed them gone. Their legal status transformed into something that existed only in Dunor's private records. The guest book entries suggested they'd been able to move around, present in some way that required weekly notation, but no formal medical documentation. A handwriting expert examined the guest record, his report added another disturbing detail. The entries for all 6 names had been written by the same hand, but not Dunor's. The writing matched samples from patient intake forms, suggesting the men themselves had been signing the guest book. Week after week, year after year, They'd recorded their own presence in a facility their families believed they'd left. What could keep 6 badly injured men at a faraway mountain lodge for over 10 years after their official discharge? What change had happened that turned them from patients needing treatment to something else? Something that Dunor documented only through these mysterious guest entries. The handwriting getting worse offered the only clue. In 1954, the signatures looked steady and clear. By the early 1960s, they showed increasing shakiness. The final entries in October of 1967 were barely readable, the letters distorted as if written by hands that had forgotten how to form words properly. Whatever had happened to these 6 men during their years at Ridgway Lodge, it had slowly robbed them of something basic. And when the facility closed suddenly in October of 1967, they had vanished along with Dr. Gerald Dunor, leaving only their worsening signatures as evidence they'd ever existed at all. The medical wing had been sealed since 1967. When state investigators finally forced the locked door in January of 1980, the smell hit them first. Decades of stale air, chemical residue, and something organic that had broken down slowly in the mountain cold. The second floor contained 12 patient rooms arranged along a central hallway. Each room held a metal frame bed bolted to the floor, a small table, and restraint mechanisms built directly into the bed frame. Not the soft cloth restraints used in modern hospitals, but heavy leather straps with metal buckles positioned to completely hold down arms, legs, and body. Several beds showed deep wear patterns in the leather, as if they'd been used heavily over many years. The third floor revealed Dunor's true purpose. What should have been more patient rooms had been turned into a laboratory and examination space. Shelves lined the walls filled with medicine bottles bearing handwritten labels in Dunor's writing. The investigators cataloged the contents, sedatives in amounts far beyond any legitimate medical use, experimental compounds that had never received approval for human use, substances that had been banned by the Food and Drug Administration in the 1930s. An examination table filled the center room, fitted with the same restraint system as the beds below. Surgical instruments lay in a metal tray, their edges dulled from use and poor cleaning. A filing cabinet stood against the far wall, unlocked. Inside, investigators found what they'd been searching for: Dunor's personal records documenting treatments he'd never reported to insurance companies or medical watching boards. The journals began in 1937, 14 years after the lodge opened. Early entries described standard healing methods, physical therapy, pain management, wound care. But Dunor's notes showed growing frustration with regular methods. He believed traditional medicine wasted potential, that badly injured patients could be subjects for treatments that might advance medical understanding, even if they offered no healing benefit to the people themselves. By 1942, his entries had shifted completely. He'd begun giving experimental compounds to patients without their knowledge or permission, documenting responses with clinical detachment. Subject C shows reduced mental function following long treatment with Compound 7. Physical pain responses notably reduced. Subject remains able to move but increasingly obedient to direction. Another entry, Subject F, shows complete memory loss after 18 months of controlled administration. Recognition of family photographs absent, useful for extended observation. The journals never used real names, only letter designations, but investigators could match the admission dates with known patients. Subject C was Clarence Drummond. Subject F was Harold Finch. Dunor had been systematically destroying their mental functions while billing insurance companies for healing services. The most disturbing entries came from the 1950s. Dunor described his subjects as having reached optimal states for his research. Physically able to function, but mentally reduced to the point of complete dependency. They could perform basic tasks, follow simple instructions, but lacked any capacity for independent thought or decision-making. He transformed badly injured men into something else entirely through years of chemical intervention. The entries explained the guest book signatures. These men had been signing in weekly because Dunor required them to practice basic motor skills. The worsening handwriting showed progressive brain damage from whatever compounds he'd been giving them. By 1967, the journal showed several subjects could bear. Lie hold a pen. His final entries were dated October 15, 1967. The writing showed unusual emotion. The experiment has gone beyond its useful limits. Subjects require constant supervision without yielding new data. Money problems with insurance audits require immediate stopping. We'll relocate and establish new methods elsewhere. The journal ended there, mid-sentence in the final line. Subject disposition requires careful. Whatever Dunor had planned for the 6 men whose minds he'd destroyed, he'd never recorded it. The sudden ending suggested something had interrupted him, forced him to abandon the facility more quickly than he intended. Investigators found no sign of what had caused his sudden departure, or what had happened to the subjects whose worsening signatures filled the guest book until that same October week. The examination room's far corner held one final piece of evidence, a door leading to a narrow staircase going down into darkness. The investigators would need digging equipment to explore what lay below. Ground-reading radar swept the wooded area behind Ridgway Lodge in February of 1980. The technology was still fairly new for crime applications, but the readings showed unmistakable oddities: 17 distinct disturbances in the soil arranged in 2 rough rows about 30 feet from the building's rear wall. The area had never appeared on any property survey as a cemetery. No markers, no headstones, no sign that burials had happened there. But the radar signatures matched those of grave sites, and the depth patterns suggested burials made over different time periods rather than all at once. Digging began on a cold morning in early March. The crime team started with the site that radar showed was most recent. 3 feet down, they found remains wrapped in canvas tarp rather than placed in a coffin. Dental records identified the body as Arnold Vickery, dead approximately 12 years based on decay analysis. Cause of death proved impossible to determine with certainty, but the medical examiner noted something unusual. Vickery's bone structure showed evidence of long-term poor nutrition, despite Dunor's records claiming he'd received proper care until 1967. The second grave held Clarence Drummond. The third contained Eugene Lattimore. All 3 had died within weeks of each other in late 1967, around the time Dunor abandoned the facility. None of these deaths had been reported to authorities. None had created the death certificates Dunor had filed with distant county offices. These were burials done in secret, bodies disposed of without legal paperwork or family notification. The 4th grave yielded remains that confused the investigation team. Dental records identified the person as Bernard Stark, but according to Dunor's fake death certificate, Stark had died in 1961. The actual remains showed he died much more recently, probably within the same October 1967 time frame as the others. Dunor had filed the fake death certificate 6 years before actually killing him, a timeline that made no sense until investigators realized he needed to stop the insurance billing while keeping Stark alive for continued experiments. 17 graves total, but Dunor's records accounted for only 12 deaths across the lodge's entire operation. The crime team found 5 bodies that had never appeared in any official paperwork whatsoever. These people had been admitted to Ridgway Lodge, subjected to Dunor's experiments, died, and been buried without anyone outside the facility ever knowing they'd died. Walter Pewitt and Harold Finch were among the 17. The complete set of 6 men from the guest book had ended here, disposed of in unmarked graves when their usefulness to Dunor's research ended. But the other 11 bodies told a darker story. These were earlier subjects, men who died during the experimental phases before Dunor refined his methods in the 1950s. The medical examiner's reports revealed troubling patterns. Several bodies showed evidence of multiple healed fractures inconsistent with their original admission injuries. Others displayed bone breakdown, suggesting long periods of not being able to move. Chemical analysis of remaining tissue samples found traces of compounds that had no legitimate medical use, substances that would have caused severe brain damage over time. One discovery particularly disturbed investigators. 3 of the bodies showed signs they'd been buried, while the people were still barely alive. Soil particles in breathing passages, defensive wounds on hands where they'd clawed at the canvas wrapping. Dunor's journal had mentioned subjects reaching states where they no longer served research purposes, where their mental functions had broken down to the point of being non-viable. These 3 appeared to have been disposed of before they'd actually died. The digging took 2 weeks to complete. Each grave was photographed, documented, and carefully processed. Dental records identified 13 of the 17 people. The other 4 remained unknown. Men whose families had never filed missing person reports, whose disappearances had gone completely unnoticed. The burial site existed, because Dunor had needed somewhere to hide the evidence of his experiments. For 4 decades, he'd been transforming badly injured workers into subjects for chemical testing, documenting their breakdown with clinical precision, then disposing of them in the woods when they no longer provided useful data. The guest book signatures, growing increasingly unreadable over the years, had been the last remnants of humanity for 6 men whose minds Dunor had systematically destroyed before finally ending their lives entirely. Dr. Gerald Dunor died on March 2, 1969, in a boarding house outside Richmond, Virginia. The landlady found him in his room, apparently from heart failure. He'd been living there for 16 months under his own name, paying rent monthly in cash, keeping to himself. No one knew about Ridgway Lodge. No one connected the quiet, elderly man in room 7 with the facility that had closed suddenly 2 years earlier. His death came before the investigation by 10 years. By the time authorities searched for him in 1979, he'd been in an unmarked poor person's grave for 10 years. He left no will, no family, no explanation for why he'd abandoned a facility he'd operated for 44 years. His boarding house room had contained only basic possessions, clothing, a few books on brain research from the 1930s, and $63 in cash. The Pennsylvania State Medical Board, pressured by investigators, finally opened Dunor's licensed taking away records in April of 1980. The documents revealed why he'd fled to North Carolina in 1921. He'd been doing unauthorized experiments on hospital patients, giving experimental compounds without consent or watching. The board had taken away his license and recommended criminal prosecution, but Dunor had disappeared before charges could be filed. He'd simply moved his work to a more isolated location and continued for another 4 decades. Insurance companies facing potential legal trouble moved quickly to contain the scandal. By June of 1980, they'd reached private settlements with 26 families whose relatives had died at Ridgway Lodge. The settlement terms included non-disclosure agreements preventing families from discussing the case publicly. Most accepted, exhausted by years of searching for answers and unable to afford long legal battles. The State Medical Board issued a report acknowledging systematic watching failures. For 44 years, no inspector had visited the facility. No auditor had questioned the unusual billing patterns. No official had investigated why so many patients entered Ridgway Lodge but so few provably left. The report recommended reforms, but assigned no individual responsibility for the failures that had enabled Dunor's work. County officials in Madison County said they'd had no authority to inspect a licensed medical facility. The sheriff's department insisted that, without specific complaints from families or patients, they'd had no grounds for investigation. When Luther Vance had tried reporting his concerns in 1952, he'd been dismissed. No one wanted to admit that proper attention in 1952 might have saved the 6 men who'd spent 15 more years as subjects in Dunor's experiments. The lodge itself was torn down in September of 1981. A contractor from Asheville spent 3 weeks reducing the building to rubble, which was hauled away and buried in a landfill. The property went back to the county for unpaid taxes. No marker shows what happened there. The access road has grown over, barely passable now even in summer. 4 families never received closure. 4 of the 17 bodies found in the burial site were never identified. Their dental records matched no missing person reports. Somewhere people had lost fathers or husbands or brothers to Ridgway Lodge and never knew to search for them there. These men had been so completely erased from official records that even their deaths couldn't restore their identities. The Pennsylvania Board's sealed records contained one detail that investigators found particularly haunting. When Dunor's license was taken away in 1921, the board had noted his stated belief that certain patients, particularly those with severe injuries and limited prospects, could serve greater good through medical experiments than through regular treatment. He'd viewed his work as advancement of scientific knowledge, justified by the subject's reduced quality of life. He'd held that belief for 48 years, from his first experiments in Pennsylvania through his final days at Ridgway Lodge. The 6 men whose worsening signatures filled the guest book had been, in his view, contributing to medical progress even as he systematically destroyed their minds. No criminal charges were ever filed. The responsible party was dead. The organizations that had enabled him avoided responsibility. The families who'd lost loved ones signed settlements and tried to move forward. And somewhere in the mountains of western North Carolina, the forest has taken back the land where 17 people were buried without ceremony, their suffering and deaths hidden behind walls that nobody visited and nobody questioned until it was decades too late. The truth about what happened at Ridgway Lodge is now recorded in state archives, but the larger questions remain unanswered. How many other isolated facilities operated without watching? How many other doctors who had licenses taken away in one state simply moved and continued their work elsewhere? How many families are still searching for answers about relatives who disappeared into systems designed to help them? If this story disturbed you as much as it should, click that like button. Subscribe because these aren't just historical curiosities. These are warnings about what happens when we stop asking questions, when we trust systems without checking, when isolation becomes permission for cruelty. The people who died at Ridgway Lodge deserved better. The families who searched for them deserved answers sooner. And we owe it to them to remember that darkness doesn't just exist in the past. It exists wherever we choose not to look.